We've been doing this all-singing, no-dancing version of The Last Mughal around the world for the last couple of years, but we've never actually done it in this country. So this is the British premiere, for all it's worth. The story that we will be talking about and Vidya will be singing about this evening is the story of the last days of Mughal Delhi. At its peak in the mid-17th century, the Mughals ruled over not only almost all of modern India, but also all of modern Pakistan, all of modern Bangladesh, most of modern Afghanistan, and a slither of modern Iran. It was one of the world's two largest and richest empires, its only rival being Ming China. And it was the riches of the Mughals which attracted the British to South Asia, not as initially as conquerors, but as furtive economic migrants, if you like, coming much as you might see impoverished East Europeans on the streets of New York today, trying to get a piece of the action. Maybe as you might find Bangladeshi taxi drivers, perhaps in New York today, a reverse of the situation. The extraordinary power and the extraordinary riches of the Mughals left a permanent imprint on the English language. When a newspaper writer today talks about a Hollywood mogul or a business mogul, that is an echo of the profound effect that the sheer power and wealth of the Mughal Empire left on the Europeans who first came to South Asia to see it. When Milton in Paradise Lost tries to give his readers an impression of the achievements which the human race is capable of, he has God take Adam on a survey of the great cities of Mughal India as a token of the future wonders that humanity will achieve. To Milton's generation, to a man of that period, Mughal India was rich, powerful, extraordinary. By 1832, however, at the point in which Bahadur Shah Zafar came to the throne of the Mughals in Delhi, much of that power and wealth had disappeared. The empire had shattered and shrunk. A whole host of regional powers, Ranjit Singh in the Punjab, the Marathas, the regional courts in Lucknow and Hyderabad, all these different powers had taken possession of what was once the heartland of the Mughal Empire. Well, the East India Company had transformed itself from a humble trading organization clinging to a series of coastal warehouses called factories on the coast of India to a quasi-imperial power with an army. It's a very odd entity, the East India Company. Imagine sort of Microsoft with sort of tanks or Pepsi Cola with jet fighters, and you get the kind of nearest modern equivalent. It's an enormous trading empire run amok and transforming itself into an imperial power. And it does this and eats up what's left of the Mughals. But what's extraordinary is that despite having lost an empire and having lost the wealth and the power which defined it, by the 1830s, when Zafar took over as the last Mughal emperor, the city of Delhi nonetheless retained its extraordinary cultural power and magnificence, while having lost its military and economic magnificence. It remained the center of North Indian culture. And under Zafar, you have this very odd paradox, very unusual in history, that a bankrupt empire in decline produces some of the most extraordinary art, much of the most extraordinary poetry. For the age of Zafar is to Urdu poetry what the court of Elizabeth is to English verse, or even English drama. It is the great peak, with masters such as Ghalib and Dag, these great last Mughal poets, producing the greatest Urdu poetry ever written, the poetry to which all subsequent poets look back, unable to match. And I think to give a demonstration, we're going to have a Tumri from this period now. Video.
हाँ कैसा जादू डारा, हाँ कैसा जादू डारा, बालम मतवारे, हाँ कैसा जादू डारा, बालम मतवारे, बालम मतवारे, बालम मतवारे, बालम मतवारे, बालम मतवारे, हाँ कैसा जादू डारा, बालम मतवारे, कैसा जादू डारा, बालम मतवारे, मद भरे नैना तोरे, मद भरे नैना तोरे, प्यारे लगत है, मद भरे नैना तोरे, प्यारे लगत है, जो बन के रखवाले, जो बन के रखवाले, कैसा जादू डारा, बालम मतवारे, तुम्हारी मस्त नजर मस्तियाँ लुटाती है, तुम्हारी मस्त नजर मस्तियाँ लुटाती है, दिलो जिगर पे मेरे बिजलियाँ चलाती है, दिलो जिगर पे मेरे बिजलियाँ चलाती है, जो बन के रखवाले, कैसा जादू डारा, बालम मतवारे।
It's a period of Delhi's history which is marked by several great tragedies. In the 18th century, there are three successive sackings of Delhi. The first and the grimmest being the invasion of the Persian marauder Nader Shah, who carts away with him the peacock throne, which is still sitting to this day in a bank vault in Bank Melli in Tehran. And, of course, the Koh-i-Noor, which sits today with a slightly different trajectory in the Tower of London. And yet, it is never described in the poetry of the period as a grim or tragic period of Delhi's history. there is a wonderful book called Morake Delhi, which is an account of the city written by a young nobleman from Hyderabad who comes and visits the city in the middle of Nadir. He's there when Nadir Shah invades. And even so, the thing that makes the most impression on him is not the destruction and the looting of the Persians, but the extraordinary beauty of Delhi's courtesans. He talks about Ab Begum, who used to turn up stark naked at parties, but with her body so incredibly cleverly tattooed that no one noticed. Rather like Demi Moore on the cover of Vanity Fair, but better. This is a world into which the British find themselves fitting very happily. And the symbol of the first British residents, the first British ambassadors to this court, is the great Sir David Ochterlony, who's in fact an American. He was a loyalist born on the banks of the Hudson, whose family had to flee after the victory of Washington at Yorktown, first to Canada, then very briefly to London, and on to India, where he lived the rest of his life. And there's a wonderful miniature of Ochterlony in the India Office Library, which has him sitting not in sort of solo topi or empire-building shorts or company redcoat, but instead in kurta pajama with a red turban on his head. He's attended by a eunuch with a peacock fan, and his dancing girls. He famously had no less than 13 Indian wives, each of whom had her own elephant. And every evening this wonderful procession would leave the Red Fort with Ochterlony in the lead and return. And then we have a picture in this miniature of the evening's entertainment with the dancing girls dancing. And best of all, above Ochterlony on the sort of picture rail, Ochterlony's outraged Scottish ancestors, these plumed colonels from Highland regiments, peering down disapprovingly, wondering what's happened to Ur Devi in the Indian sun. Mughal Delhi seduced these British ambassadors, sent to rein in the Mughal emperors, and instead it was not the British who colonized Delhi at this period. It was the British ambassadors who were themselves colonized. The current of colonization was somehow reversed. Such was the attractiveness of this civilization. Such was the cultural magnificence that they saw, that they adapted themselves rather than the other way around. The best advert, though, for the extraordinary attractiveness, I think, of Delhi's social life at this period is the great Ghalib, the greatest of all the Urdu poets of the period. And while his Urdu poetry is technically very difficult and complex, his letters, his prose, is very immediate and easily comprehensible. And there's a wonderful edition of them translated by Ralph Russell, who died last year, in OUP, which I would highly recommend to anyone who wants to get a flavor of Delhi society at this period. I'll just read one extract before we have one sung to you. This is a letter that Ghalib writes to a friend of his, and the friend's mistress has just died, and the friend is in mourning. And Ghalib can't be bothered. He says, cut it out. Mirza Sahib, I don't like the way you are going on. In the days of my lusty youth, a man of perfect wisdom counselled me, abstinence I do not approve of, dissoluteness I do not forbid. Eat, drink, and be merry. But remember that the wise fly settles on the sugar and never on the honey. Well, I've always acted on this counsel. You cannot mourn another death unless you live yourself. Give thanks to God for your freedom and do not grieve. When I think of paradise and consider how, if my sins are forgiven me, and I am installed in a palace with a houri to live forever in that worthy woman's company, I am filled with fear and dismay. How wearisome to find her always there, a greater burden than a man could bear. The same old palace, all of emerald made, the same old fruit tree to cast its shade, and God preserve her from all harm, the same old houri on my arm. Come to your senses, brother, and take another. Take a new woman each returning spring, for last year's almanac is a useless thing.
It says, होगा कोई ऐसा भी जो गालिब को न जाने, होगा कोई ऐसा भी जो गालिब को न जाने, शायर वो अच्छा है पर बदनाम बहुत है. And he said this of himself. I'm just going to translate it. There is hardly anyone who would not be acquainted with Ghalib. He's saying this of himself. There is hardly anyone who would not be acquainted with Ghalib. He undoubtedly is a great poet, albeit a little ill-reputed. So Ghalib wrote a range of themes in his Urdu poetry, very, very powerful. Writing against religion, writing about what was happening around 1857, of course, which we would come to later. But this is a classic that I'm going to render right now. Again, it's rooted in love, and he says, this is after all my heart. It's not a slab of stone, so I see no reason for me to melt and sob, wherever that might be. So that's the ghazal. दिल ही तो है न संगो खिश्त, दर्द से भर न आए क्यों. दिल ही तो है न संगो खिश्त, दर्द से भर न आए क्यों. बैठे हैं रह गुजर पे हम, कोई हमें उठाए क्यों. दिल ही तो है न संगो खिश्त, देर नहीं हरम नहीं, दर नहीं आस्तां नहीं. देर नहीं हरम नहीं, दर आस्तां नहीं. रोएंगे हम हजार बार, कोई हमें सताए क्यों. दिल ही तो है न संगो खिश्त, कैदे हयात ओ बंदे गम. मौत से पहले आदमी गम से नजात पाए क्यों. मौत से पहले आदमी गम से नजात पाए क्यों. दिल ही तो है न संगो खिश्त, गालिब खस्ता
as well as being a major center of poetry and miniature painting, the period of Zafar also saw Delhi reach extraordinary heights as an intellectual center. The colleges and madrasas of Delhi became a major draw for scholars across South Asia. There are descriptions of people fleeing their homes and sleeping rough and walking to Delhi in order to be part of this world. One of the most extraordinary accounts we have of what's going on at this period comes from William Sleeman, who was later famous for the eradication of his alleged. He dreamt up this conspiracy of the Thuggy cult, which he then crushed, having invented a sort of pan-Indian cult out of sort of disparate highwaymen. So he was no sort of Indophile, Sleeman, and yet he writes of the extraordinary brilliance of the education given in Delhi at this period. Perhaps there are few communities in the world among whom education is more generally diffused than among the Mohammedans in India. This is well worth remembering this quote every time that we have sort of the Bernard Lewis account of Islamic backwardness regurgitated to us. So over and over again we're told that Islamic learning has declined, that the madrasas since the 13th century have been retrograde institutions. And yet here in the 1840s there's a British official saying that there is nothing in the world on offer that gives such good education as the madrasas of Delhi. He who holds an office worth perhaps 20 rupees a month commonly gives his sons an education equal to that of one of our prime ministers. They learn through the medium of Arabic and the Persian languages what our young men in colleges learn through Greek and Latin, that is, grammar, rhetoric, and logic. After 7 years of study, the young Mohammedan binds his turban upon a head almost as well filled with the things that appertains to these branches of knowledge as a young man raw from Oxford. And he will talk as fluently about Socrates and Aristotle, Plato and Hippocrates, Galen and Avicenna, alias Socrate, Aristoteles, Aflatun, Bocrat, Jalinus, and Abu Ali Senna. And what is much to his advantage in India, the language in which he has learnt these are those in which he requires to work throughout his life.
This is actually the flag song. The flag song was written by one of the soldiers of Nana Sahib's army. And for those of us who are familiar with some of the patriotic songs in India, patriotic as they're usually referred to, Sare Jahan Se Acha Hindostan Hamara was inspired by this song, which was written by Azimullah Khan. It's attributed to this soldier in Nana Sahib's army. And it's not only simple poetry, but it's also very powerful. You know, it's his sense of belonging, it's his sense of celebrating the idea of Hindustan, Ganga, Jamuna, the Himalaya, you know, sort of the geographic beauty of it, and then he talks about the oneness, the syncretism, all the religions being together. So he sort of really brings together his idea of the ideal Hindustan that he thinks he's fighting for in this. Usually when we do this performance, you know, there are accompanists, and I have to say that doing this in London, this part of the world, the first time, I was a bit nervous, William. It seemed like your space, you know. So I will sing this flag song, and it's right. So it's celebrating the idea of Hindustan around that time. हम हैं इसके मालिक, हिंदुस्तान हमारा, हम हैं इसके मालिक, हिंदुस्तान हमारा, पाक वतन है कौम का जन्नत से भी न्यारा, पाक वतन है कौम का जन्नत से भी न्यारा। हम हैं इसके मालिक, हिंदुस्तान हमारा, हम हैं इसके मालिक, हिंदुस्तान हमारा, ये है हमारी मिल्कियत, हिंदुस्तान हमारा, ये हमारी मिल्कियत, हिंदुस्तान हमारा, इसकी रूहानियत से रोशन है जग सारा, इसकी रूहानियत से रोशन है जग सारा। हम हैं इसके मालिक, हिंदुस्तान हमारा, हम हैं इसके मालिक, हिंदुस्तान हमारा, इसकी खाने उगल रही है सोना हीरा पारा, इसकी खाने उगल रही है सोना हीरा पारा, इसकी शानो शौकत का दुनिया में है जयकारा, इसकी शानो शौकत का दुनिया में है जयकारा। आया फिरंगी दूर से ऐसा मंतर मारा, आया फिरंगी दूर से ऐसा मंतर मारा, लूटा दोनों हाथों से प्यारा वतन हमारा, लूटा दोनों हाथों से प्यारा वतन हमारा। हम हैं इसके मालिक, हिंदुस्तान हमारा, हम हैं इसके मालिक, हिंदुस्तान हमारा। आज शहीदों ने है तुमको अहले वतन ललकारा, आज शहीदों ने है तुमको अहले वतन ललकारा, तोड़ गुलामी की जंजीरें, हिंदुस्तान हमारा, तोड़ गुलामी की जंजीरें, हिंदुस्तान हमारा, हिंदू मुस्लिम सिख ईसाई भाई भाई प्यारा, हिंदू मुस्लिम सिख ईसाई भाई भाई प्यारा, ये है आज़ादी का झंडा इसे सलाम हमारा, ये है आज़ादी का झंडा इसे सलाम हमारा, इसे सलाम हमारा, इसे सलाम हमारा।
That song is indicative of the growing feelings of resistance that began to spread through Hindustan in the 1850s. The easy relationship between the early British residents in Delhi, like Ochterlony and his assistants, and their admiration for Mughal power, was eroded as the 19th century, first half of the 19th century progressed. And you had a growing arrogance as British power grew, and a growing assertiveness by the people of Hindustan, and a wish to resist this growing British arrogance. Alongside the arrogance and the growing power, there was also a change in the religious tenor of the period. This was the age of the rise of Victorian evangelical Christianity. And you see in the writings of the British officials at this period a change from the rather open-minded attitude towards Islam and Hinduism that you get at the time of Ochterlony to a far more narrow and bigoted, in our view, attitude by the mid-19th century. You get collectors and collectorates erecting the Ten Commandments in Persian and Urdu outside their offices. You get colonels of regiments reading the Bible to their sepoys at parade. And there's a growing religious tenor led by a small minority of fanatics. There's a Reverend Jennings in Delhi who sets up in the Lahore gate of the Red Fort and sets up a printing press in there, which he spews out these venomous, racist, Islamophobic and anti-Hindu pamphlets which are full of incredibly sort of vile language to describe Islam as the religion of the devil, the great Mughal to be Satan's representative on earth, a kind of crazy, mad, evangelical doctrines, which are helpfully translated into Persian and Urdu, distributed around the bazaars. And these fanatics talk about mass conversion by force of Hindustan. This is never a general policy of the British, and it remains the preserve of a few evangelical nutcases, but there are enough of them to make the people of North India seriously worried that they're going to be converted by force. And this all comes to a head famously with the change in the armaments of the East India Company in 1856, when they, having failed to keep up with the firepower of the Afghans in the First Afghan War, where they're comprehensively outgunned by the long Jazales and the Victorian sniper rifles that the Afghans are using, they import the new Enfield rifle from Britain. And the Enfield rifle is, as its name suggests, a rifle. The barrel has these curvilinear striations within the barrel, and in order to get the charge down it, the cartridge is greased. Now, the East India Company could have chose to make this cartridge greased in olive oil or nice unguents from the body shop, or L'Occitane en Provence, or beeswax, or all sorts of lovely things they could have put down. Instead, they chose, in a decision characteristic of the sensitivity of the company at this period, to coat these cartridges in a mixture of pig fat and cow fat, which is insulting to both Hindus and Muslims, and the sepoys had to bite this thing to open it up as part of the drill and pour it down the barrel. And even the British officers and riflemen hated biting this thing, because the dum-dum factory in Calcutta, which made these cartridges, seems to have put far too much grease. It's like eating a sort of pot of Vaseline every time you bit this thing. But for particularly the Hindu sepoys, it was also religiously violating. And there were enough evangelical fanatics around talking about forced conversion to make the sepoys believe that this was part of a process of removing their caste and alienating them from their religion prior to a process of forced conversion. The rumor of this spread very quickly, despite the fact that the grease was changed as soon as it became clear that this was going to be a problem. But it finally ignited on the 6th of May, 1857, in Meerut, when the first of these rifles were issued to the troops. Several of the troops refused to bite the bullet, which is where that phrase comes from, and were, despite being veterans from the conflict in Afghanistan, who'd fought loyally for the British for years, they were sentenced to 30 years hard labor and locked away in the cantonment prison. That night, it's alleged that the prostitutes in the bazaar taunted the sepoys and said they would refuse to sleep with them until they liberated their colleagues. So because of this, or partly because of this, the sepoys liberated their brothers from the prisons while the British were in church on a Sunday evening, massacred their officers, and marched on Delhi.
Meerut is लोगों ने लूटे शाल दो शाले, हाँ लोगों ने लूटे शाल दो शाले, मेरे प्यारे ने लूटा रुमाल। मेरठ का सदर बाजार है, मेरे सैया लूटे न जाने। लोगों ने लूटे शाल दो शाले, मेरे प्यारे ने लूटा रुमाल। लोगों ने लूटे थाली कटोरे, मेरे प्यारे ने लूटा गिलास। मेरठ का सदर बाजार है, हाँ मेरे सैया लूटे न जाने। लोगों ने लूटे, हाँ लोगों ने लूटे गोले छुआरे, मेरे प्यारे ने लूटा बादाम। मेरे सैया लूटे न जाने। लोगों ने लूटे, हाँ लोगों ने लूटे शाल दो शाले, मेरठ का सदर बाजार है, हाँ लोगों ने लूटे मोहरे अशरफी, लोगों ने लूटे मोहरे अशरफी, मेरे प्यारे ने लूटा गोदाम। मेरे सैया लूटे न जाने, लूटे न जाने, सैया मेरा लूटे न जाने। हाँ लोगों ने लूटे शाल दो शाले, हाँ लोगों ने लूटे मेरठ का सदर बाजार है, मेरे सैया हाँ सैया लूटे न जाने।
On the 7th of May, 1857, the rebel sepoys from Meerut get on their horses and head for Delhi. And they appear on the morning of the 7th, having ridden all night, and they take Delhi. And it's a measure of how unpopular the British have become and how widespread these feelings of resistance are, that within a month, the British have lost, of their sepoy army of 169,000 troops, 132,000 go into join the rebellion. Only 30,000 remain loyal. It's an extraordinary thing, and within 1 month, this has spread throughout in the entire Hindustan. 100,000 of those rebel sepoys converge on Delhi and seek the leadership of Zafar. It is, within 3 weeks, the largest revolt to take place against the British and the most serious threat to the British Empire that takes place anywhere in the empire in the entire 19th century. It is the largest anti-colonial revolt of any sort, anywhere in this era. It looks, for the first few months, as if it is going to sweep away the East India Company completely. But the British are saved by the fact that the Mughals, for the previous 30, 40 years, have forgotten the whole business of administration. They've been so busy singing these gorgeous ghazals and composing couplets and poetry and doing gorgeous miniatures and enjoying the dancing girls with their clever tattoos that they've forgotten the whole business of logistical and military planning. When the 100,000 troops, a huge army, has arrived, when they exhaust their supplies, there's no more supplies being gathered to feed them. There's no money to pay them. There's no taxes being gathered. And all the basic boring bureaucracy that an army requires is absent. There is no clear leadership. The princes vie among each other for control. And by mid-July, things are getting serious. There is no food, there's no organization. The British have established a small base on top of the ridge. And meanwhile, having lost their entire sepoy army, the very capable governor of the Punjab, Sir John Lawrence, has managed to conjure up an entirely new army made up of the Sikhs, who have only recently been conquered by the East India Company, and a whole lot of freebooters from the areas that the Americans are busy raining with drones at the moment in Waziristan and Fatah, the tribal territories. And so this army of Pathans who've never needed much encouragement to come and loot Hindustan gather and trundle down the great trunk road. And by mid-August, they are on the ridge. The artillery from Firozpur has been brought down the Grand Trunk Road, including the kind of 19th century equivalent of the super gun, this enormous cannon that needs 100 elephants to pull it. And it's trained on the walls of Delhi, and particularly on the area around Kashmiri Gate. And on the 6th of September, the British go in, and they're instructed to take no prisoners. Any male above the age of 13 is considered fair game. The orders went out to shoot every soul, recorded Edward Vibbarter, 19-year-old British officer. It was literally murder. I've seen many bloody and awful sights lately, but the one I witnessed yesterday I pray I never see again. The women were all spared, but their screams on seeing their husbands and sons butchered were most painful. Heaven knows I feel no pity. But when some old grey-bearded man is brought out and shot before your very eyes, hard must be that man's heart, I think, who can look on with indifference. Having slaughtered the city, having blocked the gates to prevent the exit, having laid waste to the city, the British then march out in pursuit of the rebels who've headed off towards Lucknow. The march through the city, out into the country, was simply awful, wrote Richard Barter. Our advance guard, consisting of cavalry and artillery, had burst and squashed the dead bodies, which lay swelled to an enormous size in the Chandi Chowk, and the stench was fearful. Men and officers were sick all round, and I thought we'd never get through the city. It was a ride I don't care ever to take again, and the horse felt it as much as I did, for he snorted and shook as he slid rather than walked over the abominations with which the streets were covered. Dead bodies were strewn about in all directions, in every attitude that the death struggle had caused them to assume, in every stage of decomposition. In many cases, the positions of the bodies were appallingly lifelike. Some lay with their arms uplifted as if beckoning, and indeed the whole scene was weird and terrible beyond description. The atmosphere was unimaginably disgusting, laden as it was with the most noxious and sickening odors.
Ali. तज़किरा दे लिए मरहूम का दोस्त ना छेड़, न सुना जाएगा हमसे ये फसाना हरगिज़। सोबते अगली मुसव्विर हमें याद आएंगी, कोई दिलचस्प मुरक्का ना दिखाना हरगिज़। तज़किरा दे लिए मरहूम का दोस्त ना छेड़, न सुना जाएगा हमसे ये फसाना हरगिज़। चप्पे चप्पे पे है यहाँ गोहरे यकता तह खाक, चप्पे चप्पे पे है यहाँ गोहरे यकता तह खाक। दफन होगा कहीं इतना न खजाना हरगिज़। तज़किरा दे लिए मरहूम का दोस्त ना छेड़, न न सुना जाएगा हमसे ये फसाना हरगिज। कभी ए इल्मो हुनर घर था तुम्हारा दिल्ली, कभी ए इल्मो हुनर घर था तुम्हारा दिल्ली। हमको भूलेंगे तो घर भूल न जाना हरगिज, न सुना जाएगा हमसे ये फसाना हरगिज। गालिबो शिफ्ताओ नैरो आजुर्दा और ज़ौक़ सब दिखाएगा ये शक्लें न ज़माना हरगिज। अब दिखाएगा ये शक्लें न ज़माना हरगिज। तज़किरा दिलिए मरहूम का ए दोस्त ना छेड़, न सुना जाएगा हमसे ये फसाना हरगिज। रात आखिर हुई और बज़्म सुखन है खाली, रात आखिर हुई और बज़्म सुखन खाली। या मुनासिब नहीं रो रो के रुलाना हरगिज, या मुनासिब नहीं रो रो के रुलाना हरगिज। ना सुना जाएगा हमसे ये फसाना हरगिज, ये फसाना हरगिज, ये फसाना हरगिज।
As the city is being looted, Zafar slips out and takes refuge in the tomb of his ancestor Humayun, near the great shrine of Nizamuddin. And there his wife stitches up a deal with the British intelligence chief, William Hodgson, that they will surrender if their life is guaranteed to them. And Hodgson comes and picks them up and takes them off to the Red Fort, but they're not put back in the throne room. He's thrown into the stables, where he's put on display like a bear in a cage in a zoo, according to one British officer. Hodgson then goes back the following day and takes the princes who'd led the rebellion, and just before they reach the city of Delhi, despite having taken their surrender, he orders them out of the palanquin, orders them to strip naked, then shoots them dead and throws their bodies at the Kotwal. Zafar is put on trial. It's a show trial, a whole ludicrous conspiracy theory is hatched by the prosecution that it's an international Islamic conspiracy spreading to Tehran and Mecca, with echoes of the conspiracy theories we've seen in recent years. And Zafar is made out in the trial to be the evil genius pulling the strings of this international Islamic conspiracy. Such is the power of the propaganda at this period that the leading British journalist, the very first war correspondent, William Howard Russell, who has reported this, asked to see Zafar the night before he was deported from Delhi, and imagines he's going to see someone like this sort of Blofeld character of one of the James Bond films, some figure sort of stroking a white cat, pulling strings everywhere. Instead, he's led into the prison and sees this old man in a dirty old shift being sick into a basin. Crouched on his haunches was a diminutive, attenuated old man, dressed in an ordinary and rather dirty muslin tunic. His small, lean feet bare, his head covered by a thin, cambric skull cap. Not a word came from his lips. In silence he sat day and night with his eyes cast on the ground, as though utterly oblivious of the conditions in which he was placed. His eyes had the dull, filmy look of very old age, which seems as if it were to guide us into the great darkness. Some heard him quoting verses of his own composition, writing poetry on a wall with a burnt stick.
The Dirge of the Begums. गलियन रैयत रोवे हटिया बनिया बाजार रे अब कैसी करी हो निमक हरामी देसवा बेगाना कर दी हो रे महल में बैठी बेगम रोवे महल में बैठी बेगम रोवे डेहरी पे रोवे खवास रे मोती महल की बैठक छूटी छूटी मीना बाजार रे अब कैसी करी हो निमक हरामी देसवा बेगाना कर दी हो रे मोती महल की बैठक छूटी छूटी मीना बाजार रे बाग जमनिया की सैर भी छूटी छूटे मुलक हमार रे अब कैसी करी हो निमक हरामी देसवा बेगाना कर दी हो रे जो मैं सा जानती जो मैं सा जानती मिलती लाठ से जाए रे हा हा करती पैया पड़ती हा हा करती पैया पड़ती देसवा छोड़ा गाँव रे अब कैसी करी हो निमक हरामी देसवा बेगाना कर दी हो रे
In that last image of Russell's, Zafar deprived of an echo there, of Zafar deprived of pen and paper, writing still poetry on a wall with a burnt stick. No one knows what those verses were. But years later, there are descriptions of minstrels and singers passing through the bazaar towns of North India and singing what were purported to be the last verses of Bahadur Shah Zafar. No one knows whether they're authentic or not. They're not contained in any of Zafar's 4 diwans. And the ones which are most famous were only really made famous by Muhammad Rafi in the film Lal Qila in the 1950s, and had earlier appeared in Ovaltine Amateur Hour on Radio Ceylon, which apparently was an important cultural medium in its day. So no one knows whether it's true or not, but they were widely believed to be true within about 5 or 6 years of Zafar's death. And the most beautiful translation I've ever seen of them into English was done by a man who was himself an exile from Delhi, the great novelist Ahmed Ali, who wrote the great Delhi novel, in my view, Twilight in Delhi. When he did the translation when he was himself exiled to Karachi after partition. And he gave me this translation when I went to visit him just before his death. And he's reworked these disparate couplets of Zafar into a sort of single seamless poem, rather in the sort of Tennysonian mode. But I think it's rather beautiful. And it's in Ahmed Ali's translation of it, it's dedicated to Zinat Mahal, the wife of Zafar. And I'm going to recite it in Ahmed Ali's version, and then we'll have the version in Urdu. When in silks you came and dazzled me with the beauty of your spring, you brought a flower to bloom, love within my being. You lived with me, breath of my breath, being in my being, nor left my side. But now the wheel of time has turned and you are gone. No joys abide. You pressed your lips upon my lips, your heart upon my beating heart. And I have no wish to fall in love again, for they who sold love's remedy have shut shop, and I seek in vain. My life now gives no ray of light. I bring no solace to heart or eye. Out of dust to dust again, of no use to anyone am I. Delhi was once a paradise where love held sway and reigned, but its charms lie ravished now, and only ruins remain. No tears were shed when shroudless they were laid in common graves. No prayers were read for the noble dead. Unmarked remain their graves. The heart distressed, the wounded flesh, the mind ablaze, the rising sigh, the drop of blood, the broken heart, tears on the lashes of the eye. But things cannot remain, O Zafar, thus, for who can tell? Through God's great mercy and the Prophet, all may yet be well.
किसी की आँख का नूर हूँ, न किसी के दिल का करार हूँ, न किसी की आँख का नूर हूँ, न किसी के दिल का करार हूँ, जो किसी के काम न आ सके। मैं वो एक मुश्ते गुबार हूँ, न किसी की आँख का मेरा रंग रूप बिगड़ गया, मेरा यार मुझसे बिछड़ गया, जो चमन खिज़ां से उजड़ गया, मैं उसी की फसल बहार हूँ, न किसी की आँख का नूर। न तो मैं किसी का हबीब हूँ, न तो मैं किसी का रकीब हूँ। जो बिगड़ गया वो नसीब हूँ, जो उजड़ गया वो दयार हूँ। न किसी की आँख का नूर हूँ। मैं नहीं हूँ नग़माए जाफ़िज़ा, मुझे सुन के कोई करेगा क्या। मैं नहीं हूँ नग़माए जाफ़िज़ा, मुझे सुन के कोई करेगा क्या। मैं बड़े बरोग की हूँ सदा, मैं बड़े बरोग की हूँ सदा। मैं बड़े दुखी की पुकार हूँ, जो किसी के काम न आ सके। मैं वो एक मुश्ते गुबार हूँ, न किसी